Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to summarize for you the meeting that I have just had with the logical reasoning and intensive research. America's public enemy number one in the United States is misunderstanding. By learning about the war on drugs from its roots and its operation over the years, we can end it and all the negatives that come with war. Like all interesting stories, we start at the beginning, by realizing that the war began under terms to fuel racial propaganda and then was later declared as public enemy number one under discriminatory reasons that led to the criminalization of addicts will bring upon the understanding on how badly the government has lost the so-called war. Nixon's unclear reason to declaring the war led to nothing but the creation of a highly expensive-to-manage drug enforcement agency and bad stereotypes. It's often stated that Richard Nixon began the war on drugs simply because he coined the term in 1971, and not 2 years later created the DEA as well. But the real war started years before that. Nixon only achieved its underlined purpose by buying into the original propaganda schemes and following through with them. China had been dealing with their country's addiction in opium for a while by 1860, so America, being the land of opportunities, was seen as a much better option for work than trying to make money while the Qing dynasty was weakening. As change results in opportunities, the Central Pacific Railroad began construction in 1861. Labor shortages resulted in a big haul of Chinese whose work ethic impressed contractors. The first transcontinental railroad was completed in 1869, leaving many Anglo-Americans to wonder, what are all the Chinese supposed to do now? And in a panic, they degraded the once-seen hard-working men as job stealers and violent druggies. But here's what we need to realize. Druggies hadn't been a thing before this. Opium, heroin, coke, and cannabis, along with many other narcotics, were used not only for recreational and medical use, but as a part of daily life all over the world. Chinese men afterwards were subjugated to mob violence and senseless terrorism, as they were stereotyped as addicts whose immoral activities would pursue white men's white women into prostitution. Hate continued, and by 1882, Congress passed the first significant law restricting immigration in the United States. Over into the 1900s, the same stories were cried and the same posters were made to cover up their novice views as just being patriotic. In 1910, Hamilton Wright reported contractors were providing cocaine to their specifically black employees as a work stimulant. 4 years later, New York Times published many stories exclaiming that the most attacks upon white women of the South are a direct result of the cocaine-crazed Negro brain. Later, claims that Mexican immigrants were stealing jobs and women and were highly involved in drug violence led to the Marijuana Tax Act of 1937, restricting use in cells. Here's where things get interesting. In the 1960s, nonconformists, students, and hippies popularized cannabis as their studies of the plant grew. The countercultures questioned government's authority, and then conservatives blamed drug use for an increase in civil unrest, and Nixon's war on drugs soon came about in 1971. Like said before, Nixon's address didn't really state the reason for declaring the war on drugs, except for the conflicting issue of social supply, which was not explained as to why it was an issue in the first place and only increased due to Nixon's war. The crackdown on drugs and addicts has caused nothing but problems since then. By trying to force the eradications of drugs by making them illegal only increased the demand and practically created the cartels and fighting. The federal budget spent specifically on drug enforcement has been in overwhelming ways the attempts to eradicate the supply rather than the demand. The criminalization of addicts and the harsh penalties for possession has not helped decrease demand, rather only ruined people's lives and overpopulated our prisons. The enacted federal drug budget totaled roughly $26 billion in 2015. A significant majority of the annual budget, around 55%, is devoted to policies that attempt to reduce the supply of drugs, such as eradication, interdiction, and prosecution, while less than 45% is devoted to treatment, education, and prevention, also known as demand reduction. In the American Civil Liberties Union, War Comes Home, it is stated that 80% of raids throughout 2011 and 2012 were deployed to execute search warrants. It's also stated that those warrants, quote-unquote, unfairly impact people of color and undermines individual liberties, and has been allowed to happen in the absence of any meaningful public discussion. This proving that the original 1800s racial profiling schemes had worked. Police militarization amped up the war by marginalizing certain groups under the government's cliché tactics, therefore transforming their neighborhoods into war zones and fulfilling stereotypes of the past. Police work largely centers raids around drug possession and on otherwise innocent people's homes. We need to stop mistaking those guilty of having or using illicit substances for criminals. The mass criminalization of addicts and users by the picture the government's painted for us over the past couple decades has done nothing but lead to widespread imprisonment. Over 1.6 million people are prosecuted, arrested, and incarcerated each year for drug law violations. In the last 30 years, the number of Americans in prisons has increased drastically. We have less than 5% of the world's population and over 25% of its prison population. According to the Bureau of Prisons, roughly 48% of people within federal prisons are there due to drug offenses. More than one-third of those drug offenders in federal prisons have either no or minimal criminal record. The lowest criminal history records amongst the most common reason people are put in said prisons? Confusing.
The consequences of any drug convictions are severe, burdening people by sometimes breaking up families and always leaving them with lifelong criminal records that make it nearly impossible to get applicable work or housing. The stress of this issue holds against people usually paves way for them to fall into depression, which usually for actual recovering addicts leads back to drug abuse. Most people faced with hardships of making decent money actually fall into the drug peddling business themselves. The government's supply reduction tactic has been proven counterproductive. Most addicts become addicts due to emotional turmoil in life and should not be punished for developing bad habit as their stimulant. As long as there is demand, there will always be someone to fulfill the supply. But there are solutions. Mandatory prison terms should be terminated regarding nonviolent drug crimes. With certain drugs legalized, like marijuana, we could take some of the most dangerous criminals out of business overnight. The legalized drugs could be regulated and taxed by the federal government, and instead of pouring billions into fighting drugs, we could stimulate the economy by opening up a whole new market, much like Colorado has done so effectively. It is time the United States moves away from its punitive approach to this drug epidemic. In order to attack the problem at the root, policies should focus on prevention and recovery rather than punishment. The decriminalization of more harmful drugs, such as heroin, does not mean legalization, but rather a more delicate approach. The tactic has been proposed for reducing social supply as an irresponsible one because it cannot be fulfilled. The government's devotion to increasing resources for detecting, arresting, and incarcerating people involved in illicit drugs market has failed and put thousands of sick people away. We need to educate the populace of the truth on addiction and give them a new non-criminal perspective of addicts. You wouldn't throw an alcoholic in a cell to withdraw on his own. We need to adopt a more constructive, compassionate approach towards dealing with this. For example, Portugal has brilliantly ended the war on drugs through discriminalization. Decriminalization eliminates drug time for users while dealers are still criminally prosecuted. People caught under possession go amongst a 3-member administrative panel, including a lawyer, a doctor, and a psychologist. Portugal also invested heavily in a widespread prevention and education efforts, as well as building rehabilitation centers and exchanging clean needles in hospitals. Drug arrests have declined drastically in more than 14,000 per year to roughly 6,000. Since America has put its policies in place, our prison population has increased over 700%. Drug use should be treated as a health issue instead of a criminal justice issue. We spend too much time and money ruining people's lives and increasing violence to say that putting people away will help stop cartels. Addicts need to help, not to be thrown into a cell. Instead of helping those people heal and getting their lives together, we've cast them away from society. We've made it hard for them to become stable, and we've taken benefits away from those caught under possession. We put unwell people in situations and cages that make them feel worse about themselves for not recovering quickly enough. It's time to end this phony war on drugs. Thank you.